All right, I am with the infamous Jared Chan, coming to us from the land down under, Australia, Queensland specifically. And he has a really cool YouTube channel that I've been following for a year or so. Um, and this turns out really nicely, actually, because I'd wanted to get through this book for a while. And Jared, I'm sure you have come across this question a lot too, being someone who gets into Carl Jung quite a bit, and that people often ask, where should I start, or how should I start, or if I'm like new to the Jungian stuff, what's the plan of attack at the beginning? And for a long time, I addressed that questions in a few different ways. Like the main thing was, don't start with volume 9, like a lot of people want to do, or anything after that. Start somewhere toward the beginning or the middle. But one thing that I found recently was some of the ones that came after do a better job of kind of bringing it down to earth. And then specifically this book that we're talking about today does that job maybe the best, as far as like a starting point to give that sort of like foundation of the lexicon and things like that. So the reason I'm doing this series on this book, normally I'll cover some books, but won't go so in depth to every chapter. But it's because this book, I think, does it the best as far as getting into that sort of like fundamentals of the Jungian lexicon, the Jungian ideas. But Jared, before we dive into chapter 7 here, are we on 7 or 8? We're on 8. Excuse me.
Yes.
I think I said 7, but we're on 8. Pardon me. So before we dive into chapter 8, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this Jungian stuff and all that. And so what's up and what's your background, Jared?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, I have a channel on YouTube. It's just my name, Jared Chan.
Mm-hmm.
And originally I just put all random stuff on there, but it kind of turned into a Jung channel in a sense. But yeah, I guess Jung, I didn't really know much about Jung. But I did the Myers-Briggs test, a few years ago now. Yeah. And the first time I did that, I began to cry, actually.
Really?
And it was kind of, it was really emotional for me.
Wow.
And I felt like, wow, something is actually communicating back to me about who I am at a deep level.
Right.
And I mean, now I know much more about Jung, and I think that, Myers-Briggs is superficial in comparison to Jung, but I think that it's still a good gateway, and I don't disparage it too much. And so that was kind of the beginnings, but I still hadn't really got into Jung. And then really I started following Jordan Peterson before he was kind of famous. And that kind of led me more into discovering different figures that he was talking about. And then obviously Jung was one of them. And so after that, I kind of got more into Jung than I was listening to Jordan. And then it kind of progressed like that, really. And yeah, that's basically how I got into it. And then I just kept reading and kept making videos. And that's basically it, really. And yeah.
Was there a point, by the way, when you found, because the thing with Jung, it's like you get into, what it's really about is getting into the unconscious level, whereas most philosophers or psychologists kind of stop at the, maybe the personal unconscious, where he's really getting into the collective. And then what I think really connects to people universally is then, as like we start having these conversations, we start to realize other people have found these connections too. So is that something that you found when you were, working with people through your YouTube channel and everything?
Oh, you mean, like the way We discover different ideas and stuff like that. Yeah, I definitely have.
Yeah, like it seems like the big sort of connection to it all is that he gets into the unconscious collective level.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting because with the unconscious elements to Jung's psychology, when I was first reading it, I was always thinking, what does he fully mean? And then when I started to read more, and he began to talk about the collective unconscious as opposed to just the unconscious, that was kind of where things really took off for me in a sense with Jung, because I was thinking to myself, is this really, like, could that really be? And then obviously, like, logically, you can think, well, it kind of makes sense. There'd be an evolution of the mind. There would be this development through history of the building up of um, different, what would be archetypal structures of the mind throughout time. And that kind of really clicked with me, that particular idea, um, because it kind of fits nicely with the idea of evolution in a sense.
Right.
And that's kind of, yeah, there's that. But then on a personal level,
Right.
I was also having strange synchronicities, funny enough.
Oh yeah. That's the next chapter.
But as the next chapter, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But yeah, like for example, just a quick example, I had a dream that Carl Jung was a bear inside another beast.
Wow.
And then, yeah, and then a little while later, I began to read the book I ordered from Amazon, which was Modern Man in Search of a Soul. And in there, Jung talks about how the Native Americans mentioned to him that his bush soul or spirit animal or something
Was a bear.
was a bear. Yeah. Yeah. And so I started to think, wow, okay, that's weird that I dreamed about that. I mean, it could be a coincidence. Fair enough. It could be from that standpoint, from a scientific standpoint, it's just a coincidence. But from another standpoint of what Jung talks about, it seems to kind of link up. And that to me hinted at the idea of, a collective unconscious kind of ideas, these patterns in the mind, that we're all kind of connected and that we share in, so.
Also, do you know what is the longest running religion of all time?
No, I don't. But I looked up that there were bear cults.
Yeah. That's the oldest and longest running religion of all time that goes back.
Okay.
Might go back as far as the Ice Age and was still running in the last century. Maybe even is running in some like remote indigenous places right now. But it's basically stayed approximately the same for all known history up until at least the last century. So, and we probably all have, in fact, we almost definitely all have some link to tribes that participated in the bear cult religions for thousands of years. So bear imagery is very interesting in that respect. That it's like maybe one of the first and oldest, longest lasting gods that humanity has sort of worshipped it, so to speak.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Also, because when I got the black books recently,
Yeah.
I did an unboxing on YouTube, so I was filming it, and I opened up just a random page to read, and it was funny because it was Jung, obviously it's Jung, but he's talking about Philemon dies or something, or and becomes a bear or something like that. So I don't know. It was kind of
interesting.
It was kind of weird. So I was like, okay,
Yeah.
this bear thing is interesting. So
yeah, no, it's interesting because Philemon, I got what's good is they have on Audible, they have the Red Book. So I finished the Red Book that way. I mean, I have it physically, but to read it would be pretty tedious, but the Audible is pretty interesting. And yeah, Philemon is like this, I forget the details of him, but he's basically his own like personal prophet that he has these fantasies or active imaginations with. But anyway, So cool. Let's get into this individuation stuff, which I think all this relates, which essentially it's about connecting to the unconscious. And it's tough where to figure out where to start and where to end with this, because it's one of these eternal things that would
Mhm,
go it's a matter of, oh, and I was going to say too, the other reason that I think it's, well, it's not exactly a reason that I plan to do this with you, but I also found it very fitting, is one of the papers that's also in that book or compilation, Modern Man in Search of a Soul, is the essay that Stein mentions here, which is The
the
Stages of
4th.
Life.
Mhm,
Yeah, which is one that you gave like an hour long YouTube video on.
yep,
And it was very interesting because that was very profound to me as I was sort of on my own little Jungian journey the last couple years or so. And mainly because, we always kind of like look at things from this like equality lens of our time, is like all things are the same and equal. Everybody's got to be equal. But um, I think it's maybe underappreciated how different people are depending on their stage of life, you know,
mhm,
uh, and what's not always looked at, at it that way. It's like, especially in our modern culture, we often look at it as like a 60-year-old is the same thing as a 20-year-old, everybody's equal, equal, equal. But uh, the stages of life are really important, especially in um, this aspect that we look at it in individuation, which is this chapter. And basically it's about going from, as a child, we are kind of enwrapped in the unconscious, the collective unconscious. Then we emerge out, and somewhere around midlife, we become fully ego realized. But then, if we continue our natural individuation process, then we kind of go back into the collective unconscious. Uh, so there's a process of going from collective unconscious to collective consciousness, and then back in. But as far as this chapter 8 on individuation in Jung's map of the soul, um, what did what were some of the things that you got from it initially, and
mhm.
how we can uh, identify individuation, because it's a big thing to wrestle with.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, well, I think that if you basically, the end goal
Hmm.
of individuation is to become whole.
Right.
And so then to describe that and work
Hmm.
backwards a little bit, is, there's a multiplicity of who we are. We are made up of kind of different personalities in a
Right.
sense. And sometimes you could refer them to as complexes.
Hmm.
I heard that you guys, your other podcast, you've talked about that.
Yeah, chapter
um,
2.
mhm.
Yeah.
And so this idea of wholeness
Mm.
and psychic development is
Hmm.
kind of what individuation is about.
Right.
And it's about becoming an individual, becoming your true self in a
Right.
sense. And I guess we'll get into what that means as
Hmm.
well. But it helps to understand. See, that's like you said, this book is good because it goes through core concepts of Jung,
Right.
and then each chapter builds up, and it kind of builds up to this chapter of individuation,
Right.
and then beyond.
Hmm.
And so it's the concepts of ego development
Right.
and persona development.
Hmm.
They're kind of the first half of life,
Right.
and then that's you separating from, as you said, the unconscious, or the participation mystique, which
Right.
is where there's no distinction between subject and object. You
Right.
are just kind of, you're all one, you're floating as
Right.
kind of one. And that would be when you're like an infant or earlier.
Hmm.
And then as you develop, you build up the ego, you develop a persona, which helps you through social relations,
Right.
through work, through things like that, of that nature in society. And then Jung talks about when you're hitting midlife and the second half of life. which I think is interesting because,
Right.
you and me are pretty young in a sense. And, like, as in, he's talking about people about 40 years old,
Right.
who are progressing, to undertake this process of individuation after the ego has been developed.
Right.
After you go to work, you have a role in society, you know who
Mm-hmm.
you are, what you like, what you dislike.
Mm-hmm.
And through that process of creating and building that ego and that persona, which,
Right.
for example, if you go to work,
Mm-hmm.
that's a good, like, practical example of what the persona is. You serve a particular function in society as a role that you deliver at work. Now,
Mm-hmm.
when you're doing that, you cut off other aspects of who you are,
Right.
and you have to do that because it's going to interfere in you functioning, doing that particular function.
Right.
And so I think that as you're splitting off different aspects, um, of your personality when you're developing the ego and persona,
Mm-hmm.
um, you leave behind aspects of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when you are, um, when you hit that kind of midpoint where Jung says that you were going into the individuation process,
Mm-hmm.
is then also is bringing back together and discovering those things that we lost, in the beginnings of life,
Right.
and maybe other aspects that we never experienced either, because
Mm-hmm.
it's the individuation process is about, you know becoming conscious of the unconscious process that is unfolding, which
Right.
is your psychic development. And that includes, um, you know a relationship with the transpersonal,
Right.
which just means beyond the personal, which
Mm-hmm.
is where Jung talks about the self, the archetype of the self.
Right.
And the self is, can be conceptualized as God in the ancient language, or I guess, more so that's the way I kind of see it. But
That's one symbol.
and yeah, one symbol, yeah.
Mm.
And then there is it's this idea of totality, the totality of the psyche.
Right. The
So
totality of being.
yes, yes. So yeah, that's, I guess, the general outline of,
Mm-hmm.
the
So
overview.
essentially, we build up complexes, and then we interact with the totality of being, and then So normally, in the first half of life, we build those all up. We get our complexes developed, and then at some point, we start to. The tricky part is those who. It's the natural. Well, one thing I'm surprised he didn't talk about. I don't know. Stein doesn't go a lot into some of these evolutionary theories, but one that comes to my mind in the same place that I was originally reading about the bear cults that we mentioned a little bit before we started this was from Joseph Campbell. He mentioned how in most archaic cultures, we I guess we're not supposed to say primitive, but in our archaic cultures,
Yep.
um, when men got to be a certain age, if they somehow survived to be about 40, then they were no longer useful in terms of procreation and or uh, warrior type things or even hunter type things. So they were looked at as they have to kind of start becoming wise old men. And so we might look at it as a brutal thing that we would outlaw today, but they would actually do some sort of castration to the men about 40 years old, and with that specific reason that the natural progression of a person is that after they have fulfilled that duty, just like they had the coming of age rituals, like we talk about how um we don't really have coming of age rituals for men anymore, other than maybe like bar mitzvahs and the Jewish cultures, and some cultures still will, but in primitive cultures or archaic,
Having a drink when you're 21.
yeah, or I mean sometimes that's like I've said on another podcast, that's one thing that especially now that we don't really go physically to war anymore, but we'll see now. But the military could serve a good coming of age for young men, but we don't really have that. But they did in archaic cultures, and then they would have like a end of that age, kind of like the coming into midlife. And I wonder if, well, there's a there's that sort of like archaic practice that may have kind of carried over in the collective unconscious, but also
Mhm.
it's in the physical body. And they talk about it a little bit in this chapter, how in those later stages of life you may want to do those egotistical things, go out and try to procreate, or build up masses of wealth and all this other stuff, but your body is starting to feel that sort of like return to the source, or the return to the collective. And that's why that if you look at older people, there's a big difference as far as some of them can become super, sort of what we might call enlightened, and some of them become like grumpy old men or grumpy old women, whatever. And then some of them go everything in between. So they have that opportunity where they can pass down super knowledge and experience, because they have more experience than, of course, younger people. But it's a matter of figuring out how to go back. And it's something that Nietzsche talks about too, is that what were his stages? You start out as a child, becomes a camel, becomes a lion. And I think he only had 3 stages like that, because then you become a child again. Maybe it was 4 if you count just the original child stage. Becomes a camel, becomes a lion, that uh, fights the dragon, and all the nays. You say nay to the dragon, and then you become a child again, which kind of lines up with the stages of life that Jung talks about. And it's yeah, it's that process of, it's a natural process that we just have to participate in consciously. And
Mhm.
there's a lot to it. But I don't know if you,
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, and I think what might help is also the
Mm,
idea of shifting values.
yeah,
And see, actually, it might help to bring in Nietzsche a little bit,
sure.
because the seeds of Nietzsche,
Mm,
Nietzsche planted the seeds, and a lot of Jung's work is derived from that. It goes beyond that a lot, obviously, and Jung fleshed out these things in a psychological way.
right.
But uh, just some of these seeds, these concepts might be useful to understand, which is there's the idea of reconciling the opposites.
Mm, yeah,
And so this idea of reconciling the opposites, maybe I can just explain it in a simple way so it might make a little bit more sense. For example,
mm-hmm,
say you have thinking and feeling, which a lot of
mm-hmm,
people in Jungian kind of circles know about. You've got the thinking and feeling,
mm-hmm,
and so these are opposites. And
right.
well, it's the psychological opposites. Whether there's
Mm,
a metaphysical opposite or whatever, that's more a philosophical debate. But um, in Jung psychology, thinking and feeling are opposites. For example, so are intuition and sensation.
right.
And so as you um, as you integrate these together,
Mm,
they kind of unite. And
mm,
Jung would say they unite through a third thing, which would be a symbol or or the transcendent function.
right.
And so it's a coming together of these conflicting elements within the psyche.
Mm-hmm,
And through them coming together, there is kind of a change in values. There's a transvaluation. That's why I refer to Nietzsche.
right.
And so it's this reordering, restructuring of values
Mm-hmm,
from the conflict within the psyche
right.
between these opposing forces. And this is um, a part of the individuation process
Mm-hmm,
is to hold the tension between opposites,
mm-hmm,
in your life. So you're always dealing with a struggle in
Mm-hmm.
your life, whatever it may be. In this example, I said thinking and feeling,
Right.
but it could be something else. And when we talk about individuation as a whole, we're talking about the conscious and unconscious. So
Right.
it's these are the opposites that we are holding together. But we could talk about it typologically,
Right.
in intuition, in sensation. But you can also talk about it in other ways. You know, Nietzsche talked about it, about the Apollonian and the Dionysian, and
Yeah.
so
It makes
there's
me
these.
think when you speak of it this way, it makes me think of
Mhm,
these terms from this chapter, which are compensation relating to ego consciousness and the unconscious, which is that the ego as it's formed, and it kind of brings to mind uh, what Peterson often refers to as the Israel. It means to wrestle with God, and sort of like one another God term for Jung is the unconscious. And so basically, if you wrestle with the unconscious, so wrestle with um, your inferior function, so wrestle with whatever's on the unconscious. So that means wrestle. If you're a thinker, you wrestle with feeling. If you're a sensor, you wrestle with intuition, and vice versa. And if you're a man, you're going to wrestle with your anima projection and so on. And that process is what goes on until you um, decide to wrestle them back into place, so to speak, which kind of puts them back in that participation mystique, which is putting them back to where it's like an all one sort of situation.
mhm.
If that kind of like sums up
It's
what
like
you were saying. Yeah.
integrating them into your
Wholeness.
personality.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
wholeness,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's kind of like a the self is kind of like a buildup of these conflicting drives, or these conflicting opposites that
Mm,
then are united through symbols
mm-hmm.
in the psyche and produce that kind of mandala symbol of wholeness, you
Right.
know. And so it's a build up of the reconciliation of different aspects of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, some aspects are rational, some aspects are irrational.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's this um yeah, like a build up of that, and then
Mm-hmm.
that produces in the person this kind of this change in their psychic development. And
Mm-hmm.
Jung talks about that different people have different capacities
Mm-hmm.
for kind of how high they rise up in this
Yeah.
psychic development, you know. And I mean, he didn't talk about it like a whole bunch, but
Mm-hmm.
he mentions it in there, and I think that's kind of interesting, you know. And I guess it's kind of like, yeah,
Yeah. He talks
there's
about
these higher types, you know.
the stages of development. I think they call it in this chapter, which is like stage. It doesn't, I guess, get really interesting until stage. Well, I guess the first stages are like a child growing up, but then the stages like uh 3 is where you kind of get into, you can operate in a religious sense. And then stage 4 is like the modern, where you understand things in the religious sense, but you more so identify with the way that the world is in its totality, and you recognize religious symbols for what that they are. And so both of those are can be good and they can have their value. But then uh, Murray Stein in this chapter uses a term that Jung doesn't use, but he calls it the postmodern. But basically, all he's getting at is something beyond the modern view, which is, I guess, more of like, if Jung gave a term for it, it would just be something of someone who becomes more individuated or more transcendent, which people don't do often. But if they did, it would be like this postmodern state of understanding their ego consciousness was something of an illusion. And same thing with the religious experience, but also that those were needful and necessary illusions, and then ultimately be able to integrate those as whole, or that they are kind of like there but not there. And it gets into this whole like you said, the holding the opposites of like being and non-being, is and isn't, and everything else, is when we get into these transcendent levels.
Mm. Yeah, he kind of, Murray Stein kind of
Yeah.
talked about it uh, in a sociological way, in a sense, didn't he? He kind of
Yeah.
talked about it like from a societal perspective, in a
Yeah.
sense. Well, that's what I've kind of felt. Do
Mm.
you know what his type is? Is he extroverted, intuitive, or?
I'm not sure.
Not sure.
I don't, yeah, I'm not, I don't know a lot about the background with Stein. I mainly I just thought he did a really good job of sort of like updating this, especially because he wrote this at the end like in the 90s, compared to a lot of the other authors who are writing these back in like the 60s and 70s,
Yeah.
which actually helped, especially in like the Anonymous chapter and things like that, where they're pretty not very updated to our modern sort of like way of looking at the world, but he kind of does. So it helps, but I'm not sure about his personality types or anything like that. I just know that
Hmm.
he took over the Jung Institute in Zurich back about 15 or so years ago. So he's kind of like the modern torch carrier, I guess, for the Jungians. So
Oh,
he's kind of
okay.
the one who's, I think he took over from Hillman or somebody, I'm not sure. Um, so yeah, that's kind of the thing with the Jungians. They have their like torch bearers. I think there was Hillman and some others that took it over from the ones right after Jung. Um, so it's been interesting to get to know him as a author and everything, and and just to get to know these different types of Jungians, because there's the ones right after Jung, and then there's those in the middle, and then there's now,
Mm.
and then even like in
Yeah.
America, there's like what was it? He was in the Chicago Jung Institute, and they'll be kind of like almost have their little orthodoxies depending on where they are, the
Yeah.
little institutes. So yeah, he was in that one, which was a little different one, because that one had Gillette, and I forget the name of the other guy who wrote the books on the four archetypes, lover, warrior, the monarch, and the warrior,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
which was kind of like this whole other thing that Jung didn't really get into, but they found it as implicit.
Mm.
And that author is his own. And anyway, because some of the Jungians get more into the religious aspect, and some of them won't touch the religious stuff at all.
Oh,
Um,
okay. Yep.
so anyway, that's a little bit about the whole Murray Stein. I don't really know his personality background, but um, yeah, he kind of has a unique perspective, but it does work really well, as far as, for the most part, something people can sink their teeth into for this starting point to get into this Jungian
Mm.
terminology and things like this, like individuation.
Yeah. Yeah. I found it. I liked he had this one part where he said,
Hmm.
God within is
Hmm.
replaced by utilitarian and pragmatic values.
Yeah, that's like
And
stage 4, I think, of when he's talking about the
yeah,
stages
yeah,
of development.
yeah.
That's like the modern stage. Yeah.
And that kind of reminded me of the death of God,
Right, right,
the
right.
near death of God. And then later on, Murray Stein writes, while the modern person appears to be reasonable and grounded,
Hmm.
actually he is mad. But this is hidden, a sort of secret kept even from oneself.
Yeah.
Oneself. So I just thought it was
Yeah,
funny.
because what he's saying there is that the modern, it's kind of, well, what that is, it's kind of like somebody who can overcome the religious stage in consciousness. Like he gave an example of a quote about that place in the book, but he gave an example of it was halfway sarcastic, a comment that Jung made, where he said, in our day-to-day lives, we will meet everyone in stages of development. We'll meet like the Neanderthal, and we'll meet the middle-aged or like medieval person, and we'll meet all these people in their stages of development all the way up until the modern. And so the way that he's looking at that is like the some people are kind of like trapped in that purely like barbaric, I'm a Neanderthal kind of, and then some people later, they're like trapped in the like, I must stay in this like religious way of looking at the world. And
Mhm.
so the modern person is able to transcend all that, but the trap there is yeah, that took a lot of evolution, so to speak. But if they stay there, then they are in danger of ego inflation, which, as you know, that's the trap that Nietzsche probably fell into, and then that can lead to megalomania and all these other things. But the hope is to transcend that into the more individuated state. And sometimes, and he didn't really talk about this specifically, so sometimes that's when people get more in, like back into religion, is, you know, and there's sort of like second half of life, they get back into religion and those symbols and those kind of things. But if they, I guess, go more into like the postmodern or the individuated path, then it's something not back but forward into so, maybe more of what people might think of in terms of like you know, the Buddhist or yoga principles of like on the path of enlightenment, like, you know,
Mm.
enlightenment isn't something that really people attain, almost just like there's not like, even Carl Jung, you could say he was very individuated but not like, just like enlightenment, nobody is enlightened, they're just more or less on the path of enlightenment. So even
Mhm,
Carl
mhm.
Jung, you could say the same thing, he might be more individuated than us, for example, or most people, but no one is completely like individuated. It's like a eternal,
Mm.
endless process.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just a matter of how much that we participate in the process or become conscious of it.
Mm. Yeah, and it's quite interesting because on one hand, it talks
Mhm,
about, I mean, Jung, and I've heard Louise Marie von Franz talk about individuation
mhm,
in the sense that it is just a natural, automatic process that
mhm,
happens in the wider sense. But
mhm.
then in the narrower sense, you can kind of participate with it, become conscious of these archetypes, and kind of consciously position yourself in a way that's favorable to the individuation process or something like that.
Yeah, well, this is the quote that from towards the end of that chapter that makes me think of, which is, the individuation process is driven by the self and carried out through the mechanisms of compensation, which is that, which I kind of talked about earlier, which is like the wrestling between the conscious and unconscious, or the ego consciousness and the self. While
Mm,
the ego does not generate it or control it, it may participate in this process by becoming aware of it. So
mm,
in that regard, it's just like becoming more struggling with this principle is almost like we're doing right now, or a person like us or anybody else does, in trying to understand this process, understand the self, or understand something like enlightenment. It's a things that you struggle with. It's not like it's not like things like the way that we learn at university, like, okay, now I know how to whatever, I know how
mm,
to be an accountant, I know how to be a plumber, I know how to
mm.
like be a lawyer now. It's a thing
It's a
that we
part of who
rest
you are.
yeah, because wrestling with or compensating with this, it changes a person from the inside out. And then I think the other thing that he doesn't really mention in this chapter, but it's like, I don't know, it almost makes me think of like Viktor Frankl, how, you know, you like, the meaning of life is to give meaning to life, and the way that you really do that is to help others find meaning in life. And in the process of helping others find meaning in life, you're giving your own life meaning. And so it's like this constant compensating function between ourselves, the unconscious, the collective consciousness, and it's more like a more individual way to interact with the collective consciousness, or like society or culture, to bring about a higher level of consciousness, is, I think,
Mm.
what we're on.
And it's interesting because there's this idea that
Mhm.
there's these archetypal patterns on
Yeah,
one hand, so they're the universal patterns that we all share in.
right.
But then there's the idea that each person
Mm.
has their own journey, and
Right.
their individuation process is very specific to themselves, and that's why it's, like you're becoming a true individual.
Right.
And so it's this interesting thing there, that dichotomy between the universal and the individual.
Right.
And I remember this quote by Jung. I can't remember it like exactly, but it's something
Mm.
about um, the when the universal factors are only presented in individual form.
Mm.
So, in other words, like each tree is is slightly different, and each person is slightly different.
Right.
Um, Even though but those universal factors, if you consider them without the individual,
Mm.
then they just become an idea, or like an abstract kind of idea. But
Mm.
so that these universal patterns, these archetypes, are
Mm.
manifested through the individual. So it's this weird thing. It's a
Yeah.
bit, it does your head in a little bit, but um, I just find it kind of interesting. It's kind of fascinating that
Yeah. I
because
mean,
that's why there's these universal stages. They say you, you know, you come into contact with the shadow, then there's the
mm.
anima animus, then there's the self.
Mm.
But in another sense, it's kind of individualized, like how that
Mm.
happens, how that actually plays out in your life,
Mm.
without the kind of the jargon of it all.
Right.
there's there's a real situation in your life
Mm.
where you as an individual are actually contending with something,
Right.
and it's your conscious mind can't solve the problem.
Right.
And so that's why there's that tension between you and the unconscious, and that's what makes you kind of want to look for an answer, and
Mm.
and it's contending with these issues in life that then presents kind of a solution from the unconscious, if you're open to that.
Right. And it's tricky too, because when we get into this jargon and everything, we can be like, oh yay, shadow and complexes and all this stuff,
Yeah.
which is maybe helpful and sure, but in the um it's not like people didn't individuate pre-Jung. It's that they would, mature in different ways. And now with Jung and understanding these things, we can, I mean, an individuated person, aside from Jungian psychology, just like one of his things, and it's again something that Peterson talks about a lot, is how you could replace psychotherapy or analysis, as you would probably call it, with
Religion.
with a sincere moral effort.
Oh,
And
okay.
so that's like sometimes a individuated person outside of going through the sort of Jungian process is just someone who's in their role in life, but making a sincere moral effort in that. And so that could be someone doing all kinds of things, but in a sincere and moral way. And that's how you see um, there's lots of people who haven't gone through um, anything like, a Jungian analysis, but they, reminds me of Marie Louise von Franz, who talks about, the Jungians who's never heard of Jung. And basically she was saying, those are the people who um, go through this maturation process and become more conscious, but they don't need all this terminology necessarily. So it's the same
Hmm.
thing. And it's just a matter of, in a practical level, that might be all kinds of things that we will go through in life, whether that's how that we're going to go through our career, how that we're going to go through our family life, how that we're going to um, go through our relationships. More than anything, probably is it going to be something in a more egotistical way that maybe it should be for a period of time in life, um, and then probably after a while it'll become more in a ego sacrificing way, is kind of like how it goes, and sort of like the practical. And then so then at some point in life, because I guess maybe it's almost like it's almost like a paradox in that sometimes maybe the immature religious person, like some of us may have been, maybe including myself in the past, would be like, I'm going to sacrifice for the sake of sacrificing. But if I'm sacrificing for the sake of sacrificing, I'm robbing myself of the sort of like benefit of the sacrifice. I don't know if that makes
Mhm.
sense, but if it's
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
it's almost like, Alan Watts talks about that a
Meta
lot.
sacrifice.
Yeah, well, it's almost like Alan Watts talks about a lot, is how that if you're trying to get rid of your ego, that's the most egotistical thing that you can do. So, and it's almost, and then as we think of this idea of sacrifice, ego sacrifice, in a sort of like biblical symbol, even, it's like how that you had to have the perfect sacrifice. So in other words, it's like anybody can sacrifice themselves if they're like a loser that wants to die anyway, but it's another thing to sacrifice your ego once you've built it up and you're like a mature egotistical person. And then that, and sort of like the biblical terminology, it's like harder to get a rich man through the into heaven than it is eye camel through the eye of a needle. And so what that's like
Mm,
is basically for a person to become individuated after they've become very egotistical, is they have to slowly whittle down their ego, which almost makes me think of like it's kind of like the Buddhist idea that within at the core of each person, if they carve away at themselves, there's like a sort of like golden statue of like the Atman, which I guess
mhm,
that's to represent this individuation idea of, there's the individualness, which is that every person, them sort of like wrestling with God or carving away at themselves, is different for each person, but there's the universality in it, that it's like that's the road to walk, or the path to it, but each person's going to be different. And so then it's like we all kind of like become the same at the source, but our method and path and process to get there is going to be different, and our
mm.
role in the collective is going to be different, and that everyone will have a unique role to do so. And yeah, it's like we have to be individual in our role, but at the same time individual in the sort of like ultimate self, become like that, which is kind of like, that's the individuation, is to become our individual self, individual role, to become like the ultimate individual, which is like the self with a capital S, as Jung might put it. It's like fulfilling our role of the self, which is kind of like this uh universal religious symbol, is kind of like what the self is, probably, to in a Jungian terminology. And then that's the whole thing of wholeness. And
Mhm,
really the thing of wholeness and all this, to kind of like wrap up this ramp, is that it's the idea that we are to become, it's like a universal religious um enlightenment type thing, or transcending type thing, which is that
mm,
it's similar to what a mature, properly, whatever you want to call it, Christian would do, similar to what a
mhm,
properly functioned Buddhist would do. And in just about every religion, if they do it a certain way, it's to become like a a shaman or a medicine man, so to speak, that can kind of like
mm,
be this sort of seer of the ultimate self, and then hopefully help others plug in to do the same. But of course, most people don't choose to do so, but it's something that we can at least uh, set out to do, at least set out to take that task or wrestle with that symbol.
Yeah,
So
like in
yeah.
Christianity,
Hmm.
what you were saying would be like Christ
Mm.
in you. It's
Right.
Christ in you,
Hmm.
and then that you're living out that, because Christ
That,
is a symbol of the self,
yeah, it's like the
and
archetype of a behavior pattern, which
mm,
is
yeah,
like Peterson talks about, carrying the heaviest burden that you can, would be like his sort of like meaning of life sort of principle,
mm, yeah,
which is the Christian value, is like that's sort of like that archetype of Christ, is carrying the heaviest burden that he could. Same thing, like uh, that. And so in some ways, in that sort of like symbol, it's harder for us to not just be like that's sort of like, that's the symbol of sacrifice. But what is harder is to be a living sacrifice. And
Mm,
so that's kind of like the individuated like process, or the uh that behavior pattern lived out, which is to be a living sacrifice, to give a supreme moral effort to overcome probably what we'd call egotism and the shadow. And because like the
mm,
shadow, especially the collective shadow, is like sort of like the devil archetype and the devil within.
mm,
And so it's kind of like the process of overcoming that and defeating that through uh, compensation, I guess, would, to put it in the terms of this chapter.
mhm, mhm. I wanted to
Mm.
mention
Yeah.
this interesting kind of, I guess, imagery that Louise Marie von France mentions when she talks about individuation in
Mm-hmm.
man and his symbols.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of interesting where she talks about how there's this tree or something,
Yeah.
and the tree is, it's not useful for anything. Like every time you try to carve something out of it, it breaks. So
Mm-hmm.
you can't use it to build anything. You can't use it to do anything really. So the man thinks, oh, this tree is useless.
Mm-hmm.
And then he has this dream of the tree, and the tree appears in his dream and says, basically, you judge me and you say that I'm useless. But if I was like all the other trees where I grew fruit and you would harvest off me and pick me, then I wouldn't be as tall and big as I am now. So
Mm-hmm.
part of me not being useful is me being able to exist and be who I am.
Right.
And I think that's interesting because Jung says, I think what we didn't mention really is dreams. Dreams are a
Mm-hmm.
big aspect to the individuation process. So
Right.
that's mainly how Jung says that through series of dreams across like a long span of time,
Right.
you can see these minute changes in the dream imagery, which are these little changes in kind of like you're integrating aspects of the self, integrating things that are beyond the personal. And um, anyway, back to that kind of little story with the tree, is that there's that shows the difference in values. There is the utilitarian, pragmatic world that we live in, which is to do with, money and society and the ego and building all that up. But then the value, the useless kind of tree shows us that
Mm.
um, there is value in just being who
Right.
we are, and we don't have to do or strive to do anything. And that's why I find that quote by Jung interesting, where
Mm.
very interesting, where he says, um, "Dreams don't something like dreams don't have anything to do with buying and selling. Like
Right.
they don't really have much to do with like your bank account or money, but they have a lot of value for the individual."
Right.
And I think it that kind of touches on the spiritual aspects of individuation in a sense,
Right.
or at least an existential feeling of, you know, there is value in being. And so when you're older, and in our society as well, we kind of, yeah, although we pretend like we want everything to be equal,
Mm.
we do kind of treat older people as if they're useless or something like that
Right.
sometimes. Not people we know, surely, but in general in society, like they don't. People can get fired when they're at a certain age, even though they're
Right.
well capable to do the work, and I find that kind of disappointing,
Right.
um, because they've got a lot of knowledge and wisdom, and so I think that it's different values, and so it's taking on that value of being.
That's a complicated thing, and I started to get into that a little bit when I was almost gonna record this the other day, and some discussions leading up to this, is how much that Okay, so some people say, oh, that's just capitalism. And
Mm,
capitalism is a thing to that effect that we can talk about, but that might be something more like um, egotism. In like Marie-Louise von Franz actually says capitalism is, you know, the extroverted energy put out into society. Um, and there's kind of like with capitalism in general, if you could take away the materialistic aspect of it and the materialism, then a lot of what would still be there is good things like, you know, university research and all kinds of other research and hospitals and scientific research kind of comes from not the materialistic aspect of capitalism, but a side of capitalism that can be inherently good. And also the aspect of that where it's like, and again, it's something that Peterson talks about a bit, where it's like, if you look at a developing nation or developing society, when they start out in their development to be participating in the uh, global economy and try to become first world countries like India and China have been doing, they will become very damaging to the environment for a while. But then after they reach a certain point, then they want to clean that up and become like giving back to the environment and everything after they get to a certain point in their societal development technologically and everything. Anyway, I say all that to say the the aspects where there's this way that we treat the elderly or the older people, the seniors, or however we want to call them. I think that that is kind of twofold, and Stein didn't really get into that in this chapter. One, I think it has to do with um, how much the individual wants to accept the new role, which is something that um, that you know Jung definitely talked about in things like his stages of life, where that
mm,
in that role, if you try to be like a young person, you're not going to really fit in that role. Some people do it, you know, that's where you see people that are like 50, 60, 70 years old and they're trying to act like they are 20, 30, 40 years old, maybe. And that might work for them, maybe in the economic sense or the capitalistic sense in certain things. And, you see these like guys that are 60 years old with Lamborghinis and they've got like a model girlfriend that's like 20 or 30 years old. They might have like kind of worked in that sort of like egotistical fashion. So it has to do one with the individual's choice to take on that new role. And then I think the other aspect is society. After that, we kind of reach a certain point of maturation as a society, we will start to see the value that comes from those people in that stages of life and using them in different ways that's even more useful than we've ever used anyone. Using
mm,
the older people, whatever terminology that's PC, I don't know, but using them in a something more conducive to individuation. So something like we're gonna not just use them to like get things out of them like their body, but we want to learn from them from their decades and decades of experience. Although that
mm,
takes both. It takes society to be like, okay, we've got to learn from these people in their prime of life, their golden years, whatever you want to call it, and it takes those people that are going to be like, okay, we want to individuate, we want to pass down into society. So I don't know, what do you think of the remedy for that as far as how that we interact with the seniors, so to speak?
mm. Well, in the way you phrased it,
Yeah.
as there is this kind of conflict between in our society
Mm.
and with, say, the idea that capitalism is kind of extroversion or upholds extrovert values, so it's
Hmm.
kind of like this idea of the libido is outward
Right.
and the self is projected onto objects outside,
Right.
and so the value is found in the object
Right, because that's when you
outside.
spend money. Because when you
Mm,
spend money when you're all like, I gotta get these objects, I gotta get stuff, I gotta get stuff, you gotta get stuff. And that's why, and Marie Louise von Franz in one of her interviews, she talked about that, how it's like when a society is more extroverted, they're like getting stuff, getting stuff, getting stuff, and then that creates a inflation, which is like a psychological term that we put onto our society and economics. And then there's a boom and a bust, which is kind of funny because it's like an individual psychological term that goes onto the collective of society. And so like she put it as, when we're overly extroverted, putting all of our libidinous energy outward, then it'll cause those inflations and bust. And when we're overly, just like after like World War I or World War II, at least, we came overly like stingy with our money. Like I don't know about in Australia, but at least here, like those from like the
Yeah,
boomer
similar.
generation and the older generation, like after the war, they were kind of like stingy, too much so. And so then they had different values. And then the following generation was like maybe a little bit too much of hippies, like peace and love and just do whatever, So,
Yeah.
yeah, but the key is to try to find balance. Otherwise, there's going to be those big booms and busts of on the individual and the collective society level. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just like, I don't know if I have any answers. I've got
Oh
more
yeah,
questions than answers,
that's okay.
but it is interesting because just that idea, I did this video called Jung's deeper meaning of introversion. And the reason I bring that up is just because it's in contradistinction to the idea that economics is kind of the value system of the extrovert. And so there is this the libido kind of energy in introversion is when the libido is going inward, and that's when you
Right.
kind of find God,
Right.
and
Right.
then but the libido energy, if it's going outward, is you're seeking to make money and you're seeking to be successful in the world.
Yeah.
And
Materialistic objects, sort of.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and that's why I think actually
Mm.
maybe Jung and other people after Jung recommend that you have a healthy ego kind of development, and so your financial things and everything are sorted out while you're younger, so then you can then go and focus on these other type
Yeah,
of
almost like
more deeper work.
almost like Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Almost
Pure.
like that, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
which that's one thing I'm surprised I didn't really talk about in this chapter is the way that this chapter speaks of it is assuming the ego development goes as normal. Basically, that a person is fully ego epitomed at the time of approximately middle age. And that may be right in that the vast majority of people, I don't know if we could put a approximate statistic on it, 90%, who knows, are that way. And maybe it's going to be different for every person depending on what goes on in their life, society, maybe how religious they were, how educated they were, different things like that, and their family background, what they got into with the economics of the time, what happened in the world with wars, whatever else. But so for some people, and even gender will play a certain role in that, whether that they kind of like achieve that sort of apex when they're like maybe 35-ish compared to some might be when they're 45-ish. But there's also going to be some that, and maybe this is more like the neurotic individual or something like that, but they don't achieve that sort of like proper ego development at any point, whether they're too absorbed in their whatever that they might be overly absorbed in, whether that's religion, family, their work, they get something unhealthy in their consciousness development, but then still they make that transition through life. And so that's one thing that was maybe this is one of the longest chapters in the book, but it was still kind of like left me like, what? Not everybody goes through that process the same way. So it's kind of like you just have to hypothesize. But I don't know. Maybe that's something that Carl Jung got into a little bit more in that chapter. I mean that essay on stages of life is someone who doesn't go through that whole process because Yeah, not everybody does the same way.
Well, I think too,
Hmm.
Jung was writing in a certain time,
Yeah.
and it was kind of standard back then that you would follow a particular societal process of, getting a job and doing this and that. And we still have that in our society, of course. Well, me and you kind of live in different societies, but in a sense, we overlap so much, in the
Right.
West or whatever. But it's still that idea is a little bit different because we live in a strange world right now. We live in this
Yeah.
kind of like things are different. So
Right.
we go to university longer, or like the way the development is a little bit different. We don't have a strict social norm of what you should be doing, as strict as it was in the past. I believe. I think
Yeah.
the time the time that someone is to fulfill something, it has been laxed a little bit and is stretched out a little bit.
Yeah, like
Um,
Stein talked about that a little bit in this chapter, where one example that he gave is just the fact that one universal is that all cultures expect the sort of hero's journey, or
hmm,
one form of it, which is ego development. However, one big variation in that across cultures is some cultures, especially I don't know if you'd say more traditional, something between traditional archaic cultures, I don't know, but that they, just like even up until 100 or 200 years ago, it was expected that people in their early 20s, or about 18 or 20, become, at the point that they become adults, like especially not having birth control and a lot of other things. It's like, okay, when you are a young adult, you've got to be ready to support a family, however that's going to work, whether that's going to be through farming or whatever the case. Now,
hmm,
then the distinction that Stein made in this chapter is, at some places in our culture, that's not necessarily expected until uh midlife, sometimes into the 40s, where it's like, okay, now I have achieved my apex, whether that's somebody completing their PhD or whatever else is the case, or going through a couple career changes. And then like you said, our society is really different now, because yeah, that was very much the way that things were when Jung was writing. And it's tricky because there's the societal element of it that we've talked about, and that Jung talks about and Stein talks about, but then it's ultimately all rooted in the body, and
hmm,
to a large degree our evolution. But the body, in that, you can keep trying and trying to build up your ego when you're like 40, 50, 60, 70 years old, but
hmm,
you're kind of brought back into the collective unconscious in the deterioration of the body. And also Stein made
hmm,
mention of how perhaps, like, they were thinking, writing in the 20th century, of how nowadays people live to be 70 or 80 or so years, whereas perhaps in um, 50 or 100 years, it's going to be expected that everybody will be doing great when they're 50, 60 years old, and they'll live to be probably 100 or 120 years old. So we're going to potentially see those advances. I don't know if it would be in our lifetime or shortly after it, but well, even, like we've already seen this in our lifetime. If you can remember what a 40 or 50 years old or 60 years old person would be, perhaps when we were young, in the, just the 80s or 90s, like just very inactive when they're 40, 50, 60, 70 years old. Whereas now they might be more active, and, more like know how to take care of their body and keep it revigorated and everything else. So
hmm,
it's also how it roots in the body and our evolutionary patterns that come out with it.
hmm,
Um, so yeah, it's got all these levels, which makes it complicated, which is the whole thing with Jungian psychology, is weaving together all these levels of consciousness: the body, the mind, the personal and the collective and society, and all these
hmm.
levels. That's kind of like what makes depth psychology deep, is to weave together all these levels. But um, I don't
It's
know if,
definitely
yeah,
challenging, but it's interesting. It's always
mm,
gives you something more to think about. How can I reconcile these different things?
yeah,
But one thing I thought I'd mention is
mm,
it's a little bit little bit different, but it was the idea of age
Mm,
and individuating at a certain time,
mm,
because Jung is basically saying that this is for the second half of life, like
right.
kind of 30 past 35, past
Mm,
40.
mm,
But I think there's models um, in archetypal stories
mm,
that show, in myths and in religions, that show um, that it can be done earlier. So if you look at
mm,
um, Jesus, he started his ministry at age 30
mm,
and was uh, and died at age 33.
mm,
So he kind of has, so that's a lot younger. And then you've also got the Joseph in Genesis, I think, also was meant to have um, resumed his kind of position at age 30 or something like that in
mm,
in in um in Egypt.
mm.
So, and just off that, I mean, this is completely different, but it's just sometimes my mind connects these
Yeah,
weird
yeah.
things. But then you've got physicists.
Mm,
Their prime age for a physicist, I think, is about 26 when they come
mm,
up with their theory. Like Einstein came up with his theories around the age of 26, 27, or something like
mm,
that. And when they start aging
mm.
after that, they're met, because our what's it called? The fluid intelligence declines as you age,
Right, right.
your ability to solve problems and stuff like that. And so
Mm,
I mean, anyway, and so it's kind of interesting that then some, you know, physicists, when they get older, I mean, they can still make discoveries, but it just so happens to be that a lot
mm,
of them make discoveries at this prime kind of time,
mm,
in their mid 20s. And, there's different theories on creativity and stuff like that. But some people say you have a certain capacity, and most people just use that capacity when they are earlier,
mm.
when they are younger. And
Yeah.
others, if they begin to engage later in life, they will also show um, that creativity as well. But a few different ideas there, but I just thought it was interesting.
Yeah, well, it's strange because like again, the way that the world was 100-ish years ago, um we really looked at people as like how can we get the most out of them physically. It's like as far as like factory and industry and our corporate structures came from uh the the models from the military. And so it was kind of like we're always looking at things like how can we get the most out of these warriors, which also sometimes people call that mid phase between about 25 when our brains and bodies are fully developed up until 35-ish when we start to go on a decline. That's kind of like sometimes people call it the warrior phase. It's like where you go out and you're just like doing stuff, and some of it's going to be creative and some of your like biggest life's work. But also, I think of what that is it's going to be some of your trial and error. And that's why that like Nietzsche calls that like the lion phase, and you go out and you say no to the dragon and you defeat every scale on the dragon, which is kind of like just an interesting poetic symbol of just kind of like challenging society to become stronger, even though later in life you're going to become more shrink into this sort of childlike form, which is when you become like your most creative. Which so I guess I think of
Mm,
that, and that also it also makes me think of like how that quote or idea from Jung, which is that the fool is the precursor to the savior.
mm,
And that's kind of like usually what happens in that stage of probably like 25-ish to 35-ish, sometimes 40 or 45, is that you're trying out different things. And sometimes that's when people will try out a lot of different career paths, like you're like, I'm going to be an accountant. And some people are I'm going to be this or that or this and that. And it gives you a certain fulfillment for a while, maybe more in a materialistic kind of way. But then
mm,
later in life, you take those things that you learn and you kind of like transmute that into something deeper that goes more into like an individuation process or a
mm,
deeper, more moral effort, I guess.
mhm,
So I don't know if that helps, but it's kind of like the idea that the fool is the precursor. So for a while, you come up with these. bigger things. But I mean, even like Einstein and physicists, like, yeah, see the correlation, but it's almost like those things were to help the
The
material
ego kind
world.
of.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
egoic world, as they might call it.
Mm. Yep.
Whereas in the later life, it's like to become more like a sage or saint, or
Mm.
someone more enlightened to help people, because otherwise people start to get inflated and go mad in their later stages
Mm.
of life, or best case scenario, you become like a grumpy old man.
Mm. I guess I was thinking of it kind of in this idea of the phrase like become who you are,
Yeah, yeah.
and like if you think about who is Einstein,
Mm,
he is kind of his theories, the
mm,
same as Jung said, his work is kind of like him,
right.
like and I don't know, I think it was just like in that sense, it's
Hmm.
kind of like you know the flower budding or whatever.
Yeah, I
But
think
yeah, I know
they're,
what you mean. It is utilitarian, but
well, because when you say that, there was I don't know if it's a paraphrase or an exact quote that I made note of when I was reviewing the book again, or this chapter, is that he's saying the individuation process, or a period of life,
mm,
is about becoming who you are, but more deeply and more consciously. So in other
mm,
words,
mm,
you're
mm,
always who you are, but when you're maybe in those more egoic or egotistical phases, you're you are you, but in a more delusional kind of way.
yeah.
But then as you become more individuated, you're you in a more deep and conscious way.
Mm,
Um, so yeah, it's about becoming more conscious of who you are, which is kind of like that other quote earlier, is
mm,
participate in the process, is a process of becoming aware of it, of becoming aware of that process that's going on, whether you like it or not.
mm. And
So
becoming more whole.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Which is what we do anyway, but we're just like that breaking down of the body and breaking down of, going back to, because like, okay, if you look at a person who is, in their later ages in life, 60, 70, 80, 90 years old, the way that they start to behave, even if they did nothing, um, individuation wise, a lot of times they start to behave more childish when they're older.
Mm.
But if it's in a unindividuated way, then they're like a naughty child. But if it's more in like a supreme moral effort individuated way, then it's more like wise child, if that
Mm.
makes sense.
Yep.
But it's more like that.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like the difference between being fragmented
And being
and
whole.
being whole or
Yeah,
integrated.
yeah, yeah.
So it's kind of like that naughty child is when the fragmented personality just pops up out of nowhere, and it's
Right,
kind of like, you know, doing its own thing.
right.
Whereas the other integrated child
Mm,
is, connected with other parts of the personality, and
right.
so it's kind of in check, and it's kind
Yeah,
of still playing its function out, but in a way that it's not just going to do damage to the other parts of the psyche
yeah.
or something like that.
It's
Yeah.
well, that's kind of like an interesting way to think of it, now that or I put it that way, because on one hand, it's like there's two types of naughty children, or the way might look at it, it's that way. Like there's one naughty child, or acting out child, whatever you might want to call it, who is doing so in a way just to get attention, or just to stir things up, or uh get the attention of the authorities, or check itself against the parents or society or whatever authorities. That's like one form of like a pathological child, like a bad kid that you might see in movies, or whatever. um but then the sort of like good naughty child is one who's just behaving naturally, like, I'm just going to go out and play for the sake of
Yeah.
playing, and I'm happy just because, and I'm going to just like enjoy my body, enjoy trees and rolling around in the mud and everything else. Like, they're not doing it for any attention, but they're doing it because they're still deep in that sort of participation mystique or mystical participation where
Mhm.
they still feel like the joy of being connected to the totality of being, and that's again sort of like this, how you can be like a good old child versus a real naughty old child, which is like, there's like dirty grumpy old man, and then on the other hand there's like old men or women that are like very wise in all kinds of roles in life, whether it's like a wise grandpa or grandma that we might have, or a wise public figure that we might know, or a wise religious person, or a wise whatever. It's because that they've kind of reconnected with that totality of being, as that they and a lot of that just comes by them accepting their mortality and accepting what that life is, and um the painful aspects of the totality of being, and that returning to the collective
Mm,
unconscious. So
mm.
yeah, but I don't know, do you have anything else to add? We'll probably, as far as like reflections you got from the chapter.
Um, Not really. I'm
Mm,
looking through my notes, and
mm,
most of it I've kind of covered
mm,
already in a certain way.
okay.
Um, it's up to you.
Oh yeah, yeah, well, I mean, it's about that time, so yeah, I think we kind of like touched on all the little areas. um but yeah, do you have anything to add as far as how people can find your YouTube or your website or anything else, and we can wrap it up?
Oh yeah. Just if you want to look for me, I'm just on YouTube. Just type in Jared Chan,
Hmm.
and it's just my name. And yeah, I'll be there talking
Cool.
about all sorts of crazy stuff.
Cool. Yeah, yeah. I saw some of your Jungian videos and Peterson videos and Nietzsche videos, and it'll be cool to see how the mustache grows out and everything else.
Thanks, Isaac. Thanks for having me on. I really
Yeah,
appreciate it. It's
yeah.
been
We'll do
fun.
it. We'll do it again sometime, and hopefully get into some other subjects. And yeah, it's been great. So keep in touch, and we'll see you around.
For sure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Take care.
See ya. You too.